It's Keith Townsend from the CTOadvisor.com with another coffee chat. We're going to talk software development a little bit, but don't worry, it's not too much software development. Believe it or not, I got today's topic from This Week in Google. This Week in Google is a show over on the TWIT network, TWIT.tv.com. Wonderful network of shows. Get a couple of hours of listening pleasure out of that every week. However, there's been a topic that Leo Laporte has been a little bit, I think, colorblind on, let's say. It's around Google's AMP, open source AMP project. I think Leo has some really valid business concerns when it comes to AMP, but from the technology perspective, I think he might be a tad bit biased and a tad bit off. I think, let give you some background. AMP, I think it stands for Accelerated Mobile Pages. The ideal of AMP is to accelerate the mobile experience. So if you've ever been on your mobile phone and you load a link from, let's say, LinkedIn, Facebook, and it takes forever to load because there's heavy JavaScript from either poorly written web pages or, worse yet, bad ad tech, AMP looks to solve that by making a accelerated mobile page HTML format that streamlines the code. Basically, AMP calls a JavaScript runtime that executes HTML-like code. Leo's argument is that the experience, while great, is a fork of HTML. This is where I have to technically disagree with Leo. A fork of HTML would require new browser support. So let's say Google went about and created a HTML6 format that, or HTML, more accurately, what Leo's arguing, that HTML 5-1. So a fork of HTML in general, which would, I think, would require browser support to be updated. What Google is basically doing is creating custom JavaScript that looks like HTML. So when you look at HTML, let's take a look at it. And we look at AMP code that's on the GitHub site. Looks very similar, with the exception that the AMP code calls a AMP runtime that runs the code through, or that executes the code in a compatible browser. A compatible browser is just any browser that runs JavaScript. Now, from a business perspective, I agree with Leo that this is a land grab. When we say an open source project, let's take a look at a couple of open source projects that Google sponsors. Kubernetes is one. I think there's starting to be a little bit more of a commitment from outside contributors for Kubernetes, and Google doesn't have the stranglehold on that. But then there's the other end of the spectrum, and there's Android. While Android is open source, it's really not. You're really not able to contribute to the main line of Android code. Google has that on lockdown, and you can create forks of it. So, to Leo's point, an example of a fork would be different forks of Android. What's run on Amazon Fire is a fork of Android. You couldn't take the same Google services and just easily slap those onto what Amazon does, because it's a fork. Same thing in theory. You couldn't take everything that runs on a Fire tablet and run it on a Nexus 7 tablet. It'll more or less work, but it's not meant to work. Whereas with AMP, that's not the case. Just as long as your browser supports JavaScript, you're good to go. You can even, in theory, block AMP content by having a plugin that just looks for the AMP tag and disables the execution of that JavaScript code. So I understand where Leo's, I think, economic concern is coming from with the issue, but from just an engineering perspective, AMP, in my opinion, is not a fork. That's it for this CTO Coffee Chat. Catch me on Twitter. I'm at CTO Advisor, and on the web, www.thectoadvisor.com. Subscribe to the podcast, which is weekly. You can do that in iTunes or your favorite podcatcher, such as Stitcher. Talk to you guys next CTO Chat.